Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Our monthly panel reconvenes to discuss important economic issues of the day. And so I'm pleased to welcome back Joe Oliver, the former Finance and also Natural Resources Minister in the Harper government. Also Sandra Pupatello, who was the former Economic Development and Trade Minister for Ontario. And last but not the least, my favorite for the next mayor of Calgary, Alberta, but in the current context, he's the former Alberta Cabinet Minister, former representative for Alberta in Asia and in Washington, D.C., and currently head of the Canada West Foundation. Gary, I couldn't resist there. As we know, Mayor Nenshi is no longer running for re-election, and you're my dark horse favorite, but I won't put you on the spot in this broadcast. Let's put it that way.
I have the right to remain silent.
Good stuff.
I second the nomination.
Yeah, okay. We got to, I think this momentum building.
I'll run the campaign, Gary.
There we go. The momentum is building. I feel it. But in the meantime, of course, we're coming up to a few days before the next federal budget. And I wanted our panel to describe in their own words Canada's current economic and fiscal situation, because the final words of the budget are being written. Joe Oliver, you've been in that position before as a former finance minister. Let's start with you.
Well, the situation is dire. I mean, we've got debt in excess of $1 trillion. We have a deficit this year, which is over $380 billion, moving towards $400 billion. We know the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, has promised additional stimulus. That's in addition to whatever normal spending or elevated spending they've got in mind, of between $75 billion and $100 billion over the next 3 years. And we have indications that they don't really understand the nature of the fiscal problem. So I'm quite concerned. I mean, let's not forget there was a debt downgrade by Fitch, some time ago, with a warning subsequent that they would downgrade again if the spending continued without restraint, and there's every indication that it will. So I'm concerned. Look, I don't expect a financial crisis in the next year or two. The stimulus spending is jacking up economic activity. When we finally get vaccinated, there's going to be a surge of consumer spending, and of course there is a bit of a snapback when you have such a downturn. So the next year or so may be okay. The longer term looks, sort of difficult in any event. This is pre-pandemic because of demographic issues, and we're not looking at sustained long-term growth. But now I worry that we've got a very difficult fiscal situation to handle, and no indication that the government is going to do much about it.
Okay. Maybe we'll get a slightly different perspective from Sandra Pupatello. Sandra, what's your take on things?
Well, I, on the other hand, I'm heartened to be hearing sort of the signal that rather than the belt tightening that nobody is looking for at the moment, as we're now well into a third wave of the pandemic, that instead it'll be a lifeline. And it could be a lifeline to all of those businesses that are just teetering on the edge. They're small and medium size. We want them to be saved rather than them going over the cliff. And I actually hope that what we will see in this budget is that level of support. It could mean the difference between losing 25% of the business at the end of the day or only 10%. And I think this is the budget that's going to mean people will see, there's light at the end of the tunnel. As I think all of us agree that by now we thought we'd be opening the patios and young people would have those jobs again while they're back to school. And it's just not happening. And, now, in fact, we've got yet another shutdown. So I really worry about those small businesses. You have to do right to keep people safe and healthy. But gosh, if we don't have a federal government with this budget out there to help these businesses, I don't know what we'll have left in the end. So I'm pleased to hear that they look like they acknowledge how Lifeline's coming, and thank goodness.
We're going to hear from Gary Marr on this topic as well, but We're going to hear from him after the break just to give him the full amount of time for his analysis as well. So stay tuned and stay with us. We'll be right back. Gary, I wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on Canada's economic and fiscal situation, as our other panelists have already done. Please.
Well, I guess I'd have to say that there's no government anywhere in the world that's not involved in a deficit financing situation right now. Spending is happening in every country, spending of money that they don't have. But it seems to me that the money that Canada is spending is disproportionate to the size of the population. I may have to yield my time to the honorable former Minister of Finance to talk about what that actually looks like when you compare Canada's per capita spending with jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, Joe,
well,
do you
in
have a
fact,
perspective?
it's much worse and much more stimulative, and we're going to, have to pay the price. No one is advocating austerity at this point, but one of the things that we've seen is that a good chunk of the money that the government spent went to people that didn't actually need it and weren't hurt by the pandemic, financially at least. And the proof of that is that savings has gone dramatically up. So, we've given money to people who weren't in dire straits, could save the money. They didn't need it for food and heating. And now everyone's going to have to pay for that, and particularly our children and grandchildren.
Well, we're going to leave it at that for now, because the budget will be coming up very, very shortly, and we'll certainly have an opportunity in the next panel to comment on it. But I wanted to shift gears and talk about one of the other key economic and political issues facing Canada, aside from Canada-U.S. relations, which we've canvassed quite well on this panel in the last couple of months. But of course, what I'm referring to is Canada's relationship with the People's Republic of China. So I'm going to jump right back in with Gary to start us off, because he was Alberta's representative in Asia for a number of years. Gary, could you tell us from your perspective what you see as the opportunities and the challenges vis-a-vis China?
It's important to note that our exports to China have continued to grow, even as there have been challenges with our diplomatic relationships with China, which I think have really been the worst that they've been in 3 or 4 decades. It's astonishing to see the situation between our two countries, and to some degree we're caught between the United States and China as well. And I think that Canada has important issues to raise, particularly first and foremost with the Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but also issues as they relate to Canadians who may be expatriates that are in Hong Kong. We look at the situation of the Uyghurs in northwestern China. So there are a lot of legitimate issues that Canadians need to raise. The question that is the important one is, can you continue trade even as you raise these diplomatic issues? Trying to replace a marketplace the size of China is no easy thing to do. You may recall a couple of years ago that there was a prohibition on Canadian canola going into China. Canadian sellers were not able to fully replace that with marketplaces from elsewhere. So while it's a good idea to continue to diversify the marketplaces that we sell to, I think that we should be looking at what other trade partners are doing. You've got the EU that's engaged in a free trade agreement with China. Australia, New Zealand have joined RCEP, a trading agreement with China. The United States has started their phase 1 agreement with China, and many of the products that are in that phase 1 agreement are the very same things that Canada sells to China. So we ought not be naive that should we just completely withdraw from China, that marketplace won't be simply replaced by some other supplier eager to replace Canadian sales in China.
Sandra Pupatello, you're a former trade minister. We only have about 30 seconds before the break, but do you want to encapsulate a little bit what your thoughts are on this?
Well, I agree with Gary on all those issues that we ought to be concerned about. But from an economic perspective, Tony, you know well about rare earths and the control that China has over those products and what that means to some of our economic sectors. Seeing military maneuvers around Taiwan, which is controlling the computer chip at the moment that's shutting down plants right across North America, that should worry us. So they've managed as a country to take people who are very pro-China to actually put our backs into the chair and say, what are you guys doing here? We need to get to a table. And I'm heartened with Joe Biden, the new president, and his willingness to consider a coalition to deal with a lot of these things, because Canada on its own cannot.
We're here with our monthly panel, Joe Oliver, Sandra Pupatello, and Gary Marr. Joe Oliver, we're talking about Canada-China relations, opportunities and challenges. Love to get your perspective on this as well.
Sure, it's interesting, and Gary alluded to this, that in spite of the terrible tension between our two countries, trade has actually increased. I mean, we export about $76 billion to China. We import, we import about $76 billion. We export about $25 billion, and the exports have gone up about 8%, and the imports have gone up about 2%. But when you look at what they are, this is not the way probably most people would envisage the relationship, because they're exporting laptops and telephones to us. We're exporting iron ore, wood chips, canola, swine. Who's the first world country? What we aren't exporting, tragically, is oil and gas. Which they need and which we have, but we can't deliver, and that would make an enormous difference. But we have Canadian fundamental principles in play here. We've got two of our citizens in prison in a hostage diplomacy ploy, and we have incredible threats from the world's biggest bully. We've got to be alert, but we can't turn our back on this immense market completely. So we have to do things which enhance our commercial interests, but not undermine our sovereignty. And I think everyone's aware of the need to produce things inside the country which are essential, like vaccines or protective equipment in the event of emergencies. We have to look for other countries to broaden our trade relationships. I mean, we're already trading 76% of our trade with the United States. So clearly, we need other partners. It's going to be challenging. It may impose some costs on us, but the Chinese will continue to trade with us if it's to their economic advantage. Sure. And that's obvious because it's been happening in spite of all the bullying and threats.
Thank you for that. Want to ask Sandra Pupatello. Sandra, you raised the issue of supply chains with respect to rare earth elements. Looking at even with the Biden administration, which is doing a massive review of China policy for the U.S., certainly the rhetoric so far has been continuation of the Trump rhetoric, if you want to put it that way, or the framing of the issue. So Canada may be in this position where there's supply chains that lead to the U.S. and there's supply chains that lead to China, whether it's on tech or on some of this manufacturing. How, as a former trade minister, how do we negotiate through that, do you think?
Well, I do think you have to go with where you have the most support. I mean, it was no accident that American consulate officials were with Canada as we watched them parade the Michaels into court a week or so ago. That was very telling to me, and probably a big sign and signal to China to say, hey, we've got Canada's back. And I'll tell you, we haven't seen that for many years, as you know. And likewise, why else would Trump all of a sudden want to buy Greenland? I mean, it's got nothing to do with the fact that it's close to North America, but everything to do with the fact that there are very rare specimens underground that they'd like to get their hands on. So I think their policy writ large is taking care of America, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody does that. Canada, too, has to be very wary, as Joe says. China will increase trade with us as long as it's good for China. And that we don't have the same control over our businesses. If our companies decide to do more trade with another country, we don't interfere with that. And that's really the difference in our kinds of states. So I just think we have to be very wary that we are getting ourselves into a corner on some very key items and products that have a lot to do with our supply chains that mean everything to the people who work at Ford Essex engine plant right here in my hometown. They're on layoff because of that darn chip coming out of Taiwan. And when I see military maneuvers from China, you got to say, you're in the middle of a pandemic. Is the world really watching this to this detail? What is actually happening in the South China Seas? In those maneuvers that are looking very aggressively at these other countries in their orb, and we should be worried about that.
Indeed. Gary, you actually lived in Hong Kong, being a representative in Asia for the Alberta government. I'm sure you've got some close ties with some of the Democrats in Hong Kong that were struggling for democracy. That's being crushed right now. So I'm sure it's a personal thing for you, as well as something that you can analyze. But where do we go on this? We want to obviously support human rights as a country, and yet it is also an internal matter for China. So where's the sweet spot on this, do you think?
I'm not sure that there is a sweet spot, Tony. I think that what you've clearly got is a Chinese government that has gone back on its obligations that were set out in the 1992 Sino-British Joint Declaration that said that from 1997, the year of takeover, that the basic law of Hong Kong would be maintained for a period of 50 years. It appears that Xi Jinping does not want to wait until 2047 and has accelerated the timetable on the repatriation of Hong Kong. It has been happening for some number of years. If you look at the integration of the infrastructure between Hong Kong and southern China and the Pearl River Delta, increasingly there's a larger and larger number of mainland Chinese that are populating Hong Kong. So I'm not sure that this is an issue that can be resolved easily. China is not going backwards on this march towards the reintegration of Hong Kong into the mainland Chinese fold.
We are now at the stage where politics and sports and economics converge. And so I want to ask, maybe I'll ask Joe Oliver first. We've got the Winter Olympics in Beijing in 2022. We've heard reports that in fact the Biden administration is looking at a potential boycott of U.S. participation in that. Where do you think Canada should be on that, Joe?
I just can't see us participating while the two Michaels remain in prison. I think it would be almost a slap in the face to those two imprisoned Canadians. And I regret to say that, because it really will hurt the athletes. I mean, and our wonderful athletes who we all support and want to see recognized, and we want them to participate, and we want them to win and do us proud. But I think it would send a terrible signal that almost sort of nothing matters. I mean, they've treated us terribly. They've been abusive. They've been insulting, and of course they've taken our citizens.
Okay, we've got about a minute left, so I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. Sandra Pupatello, where do you stand on this one?
Yeah, I don't believe in boycotts. I'd rather be right in your face. That would be how I would want our Canadian athletes in China with a new uniform, a Canadian uniform with their names on all of our jerseys. So every shot of a Canadian athlete is going to have the two Michaels on it. I would prefer that approach because we have great athletes who work their entire lives for these opportunities. So there's got to be a way to do it that is good for Canada and good to get our message to the world that we're not taking this lightly. But I mean, obviously, I just hope that we are not still talking about the Michaels being there by the time the Olympics come around, because that's a long time and it's been a long time. And I hope that our new relationship with this new administration in the U.S., they'll be good for their word and they'll make this a priority. So that's my view.
Gary Marr, you get the last word on this. Where do you stand?
Well, I agree with all of the concerns that Joe pointed out, but I may come to a different conclusion. And I think back to the 1936 Olympics, where I think it was important for Jesse Owens to be in Berlin in the Olympics and being a strong symbol of what America was all about. And I think that kind of symbolism can be expressed by our athletes. I point out that this is the International Olympics, not the Beijing Olympics. And it happens to be the International Olympics located in Beijing for 2022. I think Canadians can make a strong stand, a strong position, just as Jesse Owens did in 1936.
Unfortunately, our time is up, but I want to thank our panel once again for a great program, very interesting topics. I'm sure we'll be back at it again next month. Please stay tuned.